Hi there, thanks for tuning in to Vision. We're talking all about the Department of Sociology today. We've got two guests from there, and they're here to talk about publications of their books, which is very exciting, here for the College of Arts and Sciences. Our first guest we've had on the show before, so I want to welcome her back, Dr. Maggie Hagerman. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, so welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Lots of buzz around your new publication of your book, but I kind of want people to just get to know you a little bit. Like, how long have you been at Mississippi State? You know, what classes do you teach? What else is going on in your life besides this whirlwind of your book publication and publicity?
Yeah, so I've been at Mississippi State for 4 years. This is now my 5th year. And I teach classes on race and education and families and children and youth. So really a range of topics, but really all situated within the study of social inequality.
And your main research area is in those areas as well, right?
Right. Specifically the study of race and racism, but absolutely part of this sort of larger, umbrella of social inequality and racial inequality. What
made you interested in studying that?
That's a really great question. I think, I've always had a lot of questions about inequality. I can even remember as a child thinking about these kinds of topics. But I think really, honestly, it was in college where I took a sociology class and I took a bunch of English classes, and I just was thinking in new ways about the world. And that really got me motivated to want to do more reading, and then also to try to contribute by doing some research.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in a suburban community in Massachusetts. It was predominantly white, and it was, predominantly affluent community, which is very similar to the communities that I now study.
Right. So that definitely sparked your interest. You
Yes.
see the connection there. So your book, White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America, was published in August. And there's been, quite the buzz about it. You gave a talk last night that was very well attended, and a book signing. You've been interviewed by NPR. What's that been like? I mean, to have a book that people are actually reacting to and interested in.
Yeah, it's definitely been somewhat of a surprise, if I'm honest. I figured a couple sociologists might read my book, but I didn't know if people outside of the academy would. But that was, I had hoped that would be true. I really think that I tried to write the book in a way where it's accessible, particularly to parents who are, it's not a parenting book, but, a kind of a book that brings sociology outside of just the research realm and can really talk to people who are raising children or thinking about, being a parent someday or being a teacher and so forth. So it's been exciting in a lot of ways. It's been really exhausting also. But it's really been fun to have the opportunity to share my work with a larger audience.
And so what was your thesis with this research? Trying to sound smart here, right?
You're very smart. So the central question that I ask in the book is really, how is it that white children who are affluent and who live in this particular community that I studied, how were they making sense of race and racism in America? And how were they learning about it? It's this process that we refer to as racial socialization. So how is it that, young people come to understand these social ideas about race that we have in America? And how do they develop those ideas, and then what are those ideas? Like, what do white kids actually think about race right now?
And so you immersed yourself in those communities and you interviewed kids about their experiences. Do you have any particular story that kind of sticks out to you that you could share with us?
Yeah, so I actually start the book by talking about this moment where I spent a lot of time with these children, not just in an interview setting, but also I observed them in their everyday lives. And I was driving a child through a McDonald's drive-through, and we were in a neighborhood that was a prominently black neighborhood. And he made some comments, about the neighborhood, and specifically about a group of children that he saw walking in front of our car. And said something like, "Oh, this neighborhood isn't really good, is it?" And sort of, saying that this neighborhood was bad and dangerous. And I was really struck by that because there was no reason for him to think that,
right.
But certainly he was drawing some inferences from the fact that he saw black children, the very same age as him.
Right.
So anyway, I thought that kind of moment happened a lot in my work, and I think it demonstrates that it's not just what adults are saying to children about race, it's the way that kids are observing the social world that they're in, including when they're in the drive-through at McDonald's.
Right. So you kind of touch on, we've got about a minute left, my next question. this actions speak louder than words is maybe part of like a cliche, it's a cliche, but it's sort of your conclusion in a sense that children are seeing what their parents are doing, where they're putting them in school, what neighborhoods they're living in, right?
Yeah.
So this is sort of personal, right? As a citizen, as a Mississippian, as a parent, what do I do? How do I approach this with my children?
So that's a really big question, and in 1 minute I definitely cannot tell you all of my ideas about it, but I do think that in general, I think just being thoughtful about the fact that choices also matters. You can say all these great things, teach your children about race and racism, the history of racism and all of this, but I think that kids are also paying attention to the world around them, and so being aware of the kinds of choices that you're making and then thinking about how those are also part of, and choices also like about your own friendship groups and about who you advocate for and which kids your family cares about, and I think there's a host of things.
Okay, so it's called White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. Dr. Maggie Hagerman, thank you so much for coming and talking about your book, and it can be purchased anywhere, bookstores?
Yep, Amazon, or you can buy it from New York University Press.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we've got more coming up after this short break.
Heard it echo down the well where my heart once hung. Hear my name ringing when I'm done. Hear my name ringing, hear it ringing. Hear my name ringing.
Imagine the flu as something children read about in history books. We are at Mississippi State University, where we ring true.
Welcome back to Vision. Our second guest is Dr. Rachel Allison, an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology as well. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you're here to talk about your book publication as well. So very exciting for the Department of Sociology, having these wonderfully smart women having publications. But I want to ask you the same question I asked Dr. Hagerman. How long have you been at Mississippi State? What classes do you teach? What's your main research area?
Yeah, so I first joined Mississippi State in 2014 after doing my grad degree in Chicago in the Midwest. And I typically teach classes in the sociology of gender and sexuality and sociology of sports, which relates to the topic of my book.
Right.
And most of my research is on gender in U.S. society, looking at institutions like sport, where we've actually seen girls' and women's participation increase quite a lot over the past half century.
And so, what got you interested in that? I know we were talking before we started this interview. You played soccer, so you were an athlete. So is that kind of what drove you? Maybe some of your experiences growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. I played soccer from a very young age. I played through college, and so I've always had a love for the sport. And as a player, I also was familiar with a lot of the major moments in the history of women's soccer in this country, particularly the 1999 Women's World Cup. I have a very clear memory of watching that tournament, one of the first tournaments where women's soccer was on television to a national audience, and watching the kind of culmination of that tournament as this kind of major marquee sporting event that really put the sport on the map for women, and kind of from that tournament following the trajectory as a women's professional league got off the ground, but then failed in 2003 after 3 seasons. And so kind of watching women's soccer and seeing this kind of success on the one hand, but also challenge and struggle on the other made me want to understand it.
Right, and you're talking about the difference, because we think about like Olympic or World Cup teams, right, as being successful, but you're talking about like there is the MLS for men's soccer, which is relatively successful, but the women's league has not been.
Right, and so there's this disconnect between the success that the women's national team has had in Olympic tournaments or women's World Cup tournaments, and then what's happening in this national professional league.
And so that's what your book is about.
Yes.
It's called Kick Center, Gender, and the Selling of Women's Professional Soccer. So how did you research this? What did you do? What's your thesis? Why did you, go after it? Seems like kind of a big a big topic
Right.
to approach.
Right, and professional sports teams aren't always easy to study, for sure. For this research, I actually went to work for a women's pro team in the US. I thought that really to understand the challenges that this team was facing, I had to kind of see behind the public facade, the public image, to really see the daily work that was going on among a really committed group of people to sell and market this sport in a context where we don't have a lot of long-standing and highly successful professional women's leagues.
Right. So what was that like? Do you have any specific story where you just thought, wow, this is why this is happening,
Yeah.
or that you can share with us?
Yeah, one thing that happened while I was there was the experience of home games. And throughout this season, for instance, this was during a Women's World Cup tournament as well. And so immediately after the Women's World Cup, our team had a sold-out standing room only crowd for their next game. It's an environment that I'd never seen before in women's pro soccer. It was very exciting, and it was the kind of crowd that we wanted to really get people energized and engaged in the sport. But then, a week or so later, this attention died out.
Okay.
So you could really see firsthand the difference between these outcomes for the women's national team and then the women's pro league, where we went from a sold-out crowd to 3,000-4,000 fans the week after that.
So kind of quickly, what do you think some of the takeaways are from your book for just the average person that might be interested in picking this up and ordering it and reading it? What were some of the conclusions that you found?
Sure. I think one of my major conclusions is that a challenge that women's pro soccer has faced is the idea that gender scholars call essentialism, this idea that there are kind of fundamental, often biologically based differences between women and men, and that as a result of these differences, women are less talented and less skilled as athletes, and thus at the professional level that they're somehow less worth watching, their sports are less exciting or interesting, and this is why, for instance, we see a lack of investment. We see fewer fans, we see less corporate buy-in, and so on. What I argue in the book is that this is actually a two-way street between investment and reward, and that if we don't invest in women's sports, we're going to kind of see this conclusion, and that this isn't actually the case, that women's sports aren't less exciting, and there is often a lot of fan interest.
Right. I mean, we could talk about this, goodness, both of you, for an hour. We're out of time, but I want to repeat the book name. It's Kick Center, Gender and the Selling of Women's Professional Soccer. Dr. Rachel Allison from the Department of Sociology, thank you so much for being on the show today. We had such an interesting show. I hope you guys pick up those books, and we're all out of time, so we'll see you next time on Vision.